For Russia, armor is paramount. When Vladimir Putin first invaded Ukraine, he did so with enormous quantities of tanks and armored vehicles, preparing the ground for a series of mechanized strikes that nearly succeeded. As Ukraine pushed Russia back, the use of armor intensified. Putin's strategy was the more the better, believing that a war of attrition would inevitably exhaust Ukraine's defenses. Putin, however, was wrong. Russia has ironically fallen victim to its own attritional tactics. The country is now so desperate that it's deploying whatever armor it can salvage. Russia is fielding rotting Soviet armor because Ukraine has obliterated almost everything else. On October 7th, United 24 Media reported that Russia has increased efforts to retrieve and restore as many of its aging infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, as possible from long-term storage. Currently, the nation's focus appears to be the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base in the Kostroma region. This base is being emptied of its last remaining IFVs, and the operation is proving difficult for Russia. These IFVs aren't just old. Many are merely rotting shells of their former selves. We know the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base has been reactivated thanks to satellite images that show heavy activity at the location. Shared by the Jumpy X account, these images provide a before and after perspective of the base, revealing the removal of old IFVs, likely because Russia intends to repair as many as feasible. Jumpy highlights key takeaways from these initial images in subsequent posts, including several zoomed-in views. These show that Russia has cannibalized the hulls of several dozen old IFVs at this base to repair the few that seem functional and ready for deployment. The problem for Russia is obvious. When several IFVs must be stripped due to their poor condition just to make a single one operational, equipment reserves deplete much faster. For every one vehicle Russia manages to send to Ukraine, it's losing 2 or 3 others that must yield their working parts just to get that single vehicle running in the first place. Further review of the satellite images demonstrates the severity of the situation at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base. The base is littered with bare T-80 hulls, mostly without turrets and clearly useless, perhaps only good for a spare part or two for the war in Ukraine. A wrecked BTR-50 is also at the base. Jumpy suggests that what these images reveal is a sign of Russia's escalating desperation. Russia can no longer deploy specific pieces of armor. It must scour its bases for anything it can find, regardless of how old or decayed the armor may be. United 24 adds that analysts believe the vehicles in the images are either being restored for deployment to Ukraine or, more often, being stripped for spare parts that could keep Russia's dwindling stockpiles operational. This method of cannibalizing old vehicles to maintain others is not new for Russia. In a February article, The Insider pointed out that Russia's main source for heavy equipment and armor remains its Soviet-era stockpiles. The outlet claims new production is nowhere near sufficient to compensate for battlefield losses. T-90M tanks are the only models still produced from scratch, with an estimated 250 units built per year. Regarding IFVs, the outlet adds that only the BMP-3 is still in mass production. Russia managed to build 463 of these in 2023, a number significantly lower than its IFV loss rate in Ukraine. By February, Russia had already lost between 41% and 52% of its pre-war reserves at many storage sites, according to The Insider. Now, approaching the end of 2025, it's likely this figure has dropped so dramatically that Russia is compelled to restore IFVs it never would have considered using a year or two ago. We spoke a moment ago about rotting shells. This is a problem of Russia's own making. One reason the IFVs and tanks at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base are in such terrible condition is Russia's peculiar habit of storing most of its stockpiled vehicles outdoors. The IFVs at the base have been left exposed for years, perhaps even decades, meaning continuous exposure to the elements and Russia's harsh winters has caused major problems. Severe metal corrosion makes many of Russia's Soviet-era IFVs unusable from the start. The few frames that somehow avoid this issue may still suffer from rusted hulls, broken engines, and degraded electronics, rendering them practically useless without costly and lengthy restoration. And even after all the restoration work, what does Russia have left? a Soviet-era IFV that a Ukrainian drone could eliminate in seconds? Putin must be regretting the decision. An outdoor storage policy, likely intended to save Russia money during peacetime, has come back to haunt Putin. Frankly, the way Russia stores what could have been useful equipment is shocking. Dagans articulated this in a November 2024 article, sharing insights from a Russian military blogger who analyzed many issues with Russia's military hardware storage sites. Dagans reports that the blogger highlights how storing equipment outside is a practice dating back to the Soviet era, when resources for constructing even the most basic shelters were limited. The outlet reports. The blogger estimates that an average of 3 dilapidated BMP-1 or BMP-2 vehicles must be combined to produce one functional vehicle after major refurbishments, which confirms a point we made earlier. A storage facility holding 5,000 IFVs would only yield about 1,600 that are actually usable in this scenario. The rest would be dismantled in a desperate search for any components or parts that could be used on the vehicles that aren't quite as rotten as the others. Compounding Russia's equipment troubles, it spent years selling off its best-conditioned Soviet-era equipment to other countries before Putin invaded Ukraine. The lack of foresight is astounding. Presumably, Putin has known he wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine since his initial aggression campaign began in 2014. Yet, Russia sold its best stock, leaving itself with the oldest and lowest quality Soviet reserves because it was chasing small profits. Perhaps it wasn't a lack of foresight, but more likely arrogance. Putin likely assumed the IFVs he is now frantically restoring at the 111th Central Tank Reserve base would never be needed because Ukraine would capitulate the moment Russia invaded. When that didn't happen, it quickly became evident that Russia's massive armor stockpiles were an illusion. Based on the military blogger's report via Dagans, the amount of usable armor Russia possesses is about a third of what it was believed to have before the Ukraine war began. Don't assume these rotting and cannibalization problems are limited to the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base either. Other Russian facilities face the same issues. In July, Atesh, a group of Ukrainian partisans operating in Crimea, scouted the territory of a military medical unit based in Sevastopol. It seems Russia is content to let more than just tanks and IFVs rot away due to exposure. Atesh reported after its scouts returned from the site, "As of now, the unit is in decline, the territory is neglected, and the equipment is rotting under the sun. Security measures have completely failed, a daily guard unit is present on site, but they mostly sleep or start drinking closer to the evening." Almost a year earlier, in September 2024, Defense Express published an interesting article reporting the results of a small examination of 61 of Russia's 80 main battle tanks. Like the tanks and IFVs at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base, these tanks had been in long-term storage, meaning they were dumped outside with not even basic coverings. Of the 61 tanks examined, 44 had technical failures that likely made them unusable in Ukraine. 21 of these failures were related to the tank's armaments, with the remainder being issues with electrical, radio, transmissions, or engine equipment. Again, the 1 and 3 number appears. Of the 61 tanks, about 2/3 were unusable, and the remaining third likely required maintenance by cannibalizing the non-working tanks. Time and again, we see the same pattern. Russia rapidly uses up what it sends to Ukraine. In desperation, it then pulls from stockpiles that are already rotting or, at best, in states of disrepair. And if the Crimea situation is any indication, Russian troops don't even maintain the equipment they receive once it's delivered to them. It's no surprise Putin is so desperate. The rot is deeper than he could have ever imagined. Let's return to the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base for a moment. United 24 media states that this base is a key Russian storage facility in the country's central military district. In other words, it's not some long-forgotten base Russia just remembered. That would, at least, offer a partial reason for the poor condition of its tanks and IFVs, if not an excuse. This base holds a massive share of Russia's reserve armor. Logically, you would expect it to be a base where Russia invests heavily in maintenance and proper storage. Apparently not. United 24 reports that back in 2022, The 111th Central Tank Reserve was home to 307 serviceable tanks, with 61 of those tanks kept under dry air storage conditions. So, at least Russia was taking care of some of its tanks in the same year it invaded Ukraine. While it was only about a fifth of them, that's still better than nothing. The facility also stored 561 units of reserve armor, while another 207 units were marked for disposal. In total, the base had 1,075 tanks and 360 covered parking spaces. This would have been acceptable if Russia had only needed to use the serviceable tanks at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base. There were at least enough covered parking spaces, though nowhere near enough with hangar-based dry air storage, to protect the base's operational tanks from the elements. The problem is that Russia quickly used up the operational armor. That left it with the reserve, and more than 3.5 years of drawing from this increasingly dilapidated stockpile has resulted in the situation we see at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base today. The dregs are all Russia has left as Putin continues his desperate hunt for the armor he needs to launch the same kinds of mechanized assaults Russia used to wear down Ukraine during the initial months of the invasion. How did Russia become so desperate? Ukraine is the answer. Russia is pulling the last few ancient IFVs and tanks from the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base because Ukraine has absolutely obliterated everything else Russia has sent. The raw numbers confirm this. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost an astonishing 11,240 tanks in Ukraine between the first day of Putin's invasion and October 8, 2025. Armored fighting vehicles, which include IFVs, have fared even worse. Russia has lost 23,324 of them as of October 8, with 5 of those vehicles destroyed on October 7 alone. Recall the Russian manufacturing figures we shared earlier. We mentioned that Russia is only building around 250 new T-90 tanks annually, along with 463 modern IFVs. That is nowhere near enough to cover Russia's immense losses in Ukraine. 250 new T-90s will not cover an annual churn rate of about 3,000 tanks. The same applies to the IFVs. Russia loses about 6,500 armored vehicles per year. What Russia is building doesn't even account for a tenth of what it's losing in Ukraine. Hence the stockpile scavenging. Russia is forced to rely on its ancient and rotting armor because it has nothing else remaining. The question remains, how long can Russia continue this strategy before it returns to places like the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base, only to find there is nothing left to revive? It appears Russia is already running low, as unexpected statistics reveal. On September 9th, important stories reported that data from the open-source intelligence project Oryx suggests Russia's equipment losses during the summer of 2025 dropped significantly compared to previous months and years. The summer 2025 losses were the lowest Russia has experienced during any summer of the Ukraine war so far, important stories said. Russia lost 83 tanks and 189 armored vehicles between June and August 2025. In the same period in 2024, Russia lost 268 tanks and 619 armored vehicles. 2023 saw a loss of 274 tanks and 468 vehicles, with 2022 seeing 252 lost tanks and 411 armored vehicles. Russia's losses seem to be on a consistent upward trend over the previous 3 years, only for the summer of 2025 to reverse that pattern. This is notable because Russia launched a massive summer offensive in 2025, which you would naturally assume would lead to higher losses. So the question must be asked, what happened? It's not that Russia achieved any great success during the summer, meaning Ukraine didn't destroy as much of its armor. What happened was that Russian troops were simply fighting with less armor due to the severe equipment shortages caused by nearly 4 years of Ukraine destroying what Russia sends. Russia switched to infantry assault tactics following its previous heavy losses in a desperate attempt to conserve the ever-diminishing stockpiles of armor it has left. The strategy worked, but it also exposed just how terrible a state Russia's military is in right now. Putin never intended to use anything other than massive mechanized assaults to break Ukraine. When that failed, largely due to Ukraine's brilliant use of drones, Putin had no plan B, so Russia continued these mechanized assaults until it reached the position it's in now. There's no more armor. Russia's soldiers are being forced to fight without it. As Novaya Gazeta reported in July, Russia is practically running on empty at this point. The report highlights a Ukrainian outlet, Dialogue. UA, that has stated Russian tanks in particular have ceased to exist as a factor on the battlefield. The outlet adds that the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, believes Russia is on track to deplete its armor stockpiles by the end of 2025. This is despite the same think tank stating that Russia still has 46% of its pre-war reserve of tanks, along with 42% of its IFVs and 48% of its armored personnel carriers. With those numbers, you would expect Russia to be able to continue its large mechanized assaults for several more years. But it can't, and the satellite images from the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base show why. Having almost half of your pre-war reserves doesn't mean much when most of those reserves are the rotted carcasses of vehicles that haven't been used for decades. The numbers don't lie, but they don't tell the full story either. Russia has very little usable equipment left in its storage facilities, all thanks to Ukraine systematically destroying the armor Russia has sent into the country so far. So what is Russia trying to do to overcome all these armor problems? Its solutions range from the logical to the ridiculous. On the logical side, Russia is attempting to ramp up the production of new weapons and armor to try to fill the massive gaps created by years of failure in Ukraine. On September 8th, Defense Blog reported that Russia has plans to manufacture hundreds of new tanks, missile systems, and aircraft by the end of 2025. However, the numbers shared match those we already know. Russia wants to build 250 new T-90s, for instance, which we've already established isn't enough to make up for its losses. Instead, Russia may be filling the gaps by following Ukraine's lead and producing more drones for the fight in Ukraine. That's according to the Deputy Chief of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, Vadim Skibitsky, who tells Defense Blog. There has been a noticeable increase in the production of unmanned aerial vehicles, especially types like Jaren, Harpy, and FPV drones. That is all logical. Less logical is the Russian idea of selling its ruined tanks for scrap. On October 6th, United 24 reported that Russia has accepted that it has far too many losses to conceal anymore. So, it has begun selling its destroyed tanks and armored vehicles at auction so they can be scrapped and Russia can earn a few rubles from them. The practice actually began in May, according to the Moscow Times report cited by United 24. So far, Russia has sold the ruined shells of T-80, T-72, B-3, and T-62 tanks along with a host of IFVs. Prices per unit range from $38,800 to $53,300, United 24 adds. If the state of the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base is any indication, Russia could probably earn a few tens of millions of dollars from selling off its useless armor. Of course, that won't solve the no more armor to send to Ukraine problem. But that's okay, because Russia has another solution to that issue. Horses. Yes, you heard correctly. Horses. In an October 7th report, United 24 revealed that Russia has revived the ancient art of mounted cavalry, a practice the outlet says hasn't been used since the 1950s. It didn't work, of course. The Russians riding on horseback were quickly picked off by Ukraine's drones because they had no armor. Still, at least they could move a little faster than on foot. Not fast enough to outrun a drone, of course, but still. Faster. Desperation guides every decision made by Putin and, by extension, the entire Russian military right now. Trying to revive ancient tanks and IFVs unused since the Soviet era is only the beginning. The reality Russia's leader now faces is that he cannot fight the war he started in the manner he intended. And the way he fought it would have offered Russia its only path to victory, provided the stockpiles held firm. Those stockpiles are depleted, and Russia is now on a slow, grinding path to defeat. It is lying about being on that path, of course. Another indication of Putin's desperation comes from his propaganda. and a tiny Ukrainian settlement shows us just how eager Russia's leader is to create the impression that his country is winning the Ukraine war. Russia just faked a victory in the village of Verbov, even though Ukraine has utterly blasted its forces off the map.